In October of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt walked up a dusty mound in southeastern Turkey called Potbelly Hill. Other surveyors had been there before him. They'd seen the same broken stones poking through the soil and decided they were medieval grave markers. Not worth excavating. Schmidt looked at the same stones and understood in a single afternoon that every textbook on the origins of civilization was about to be rewritten. The earlier survey is worth pausing on, because it tells you how easy it is for a major site to sit in plain view for 30 years. In 1963, a joint expedition from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul, led in part by an American archaeologist named Peter Benedict working under Robert Braidwood, swept across the plains around the city of Urfa looking for early agricultural settlements. The team reached Potbelly Hill. They walked the slopes. They noted the protruding stones, sketched them, and concluded the mound was a medieval Islamic cemetery, the T-shaped slabs the worn remains of grave markers. They moved on. The published survey listed the site and dismissed it in roughly the same paragraph. For 3 decades, no one returned with a trowel. Schmidt knew something the 1963 survey did not, and that knowledge is the reason he looked at the same stones differently. Earlier in his career, he had worked at a site called Neveli Shori, about 50 kilometers north of Potbelly Hill in the upper Euphrates Valley. Neveli Shori was being excavated ahead of a dam project that would eventually flood it. The site dated to roughly 8500 BCE, the pre-pottery Neolithic period. And what Schmidt and his colleagues had pulled from the soil there was unlike anything else in the region. T-shaped limestone pillars, set into the floors and walls of small communal buildings. Anthropomorphic in form, with what looked like stylized arms running down their sides. Animal reliefs carved into the stone. When Schmidt walked the slopes of Potbelly Hill in 1994 and saw the tops of broken pillars protruding from the soil, the shape registered immediately. The same T, the same scale of stone, the same likely date range. The medieval grave markers identification simply could not survive a second look from someone who had spent years staring at Neveli Shori. He went home, applied for permits, and the following year, in 1995, opened the first formal excavation. The Turkish name for the site was Göbekli Tepe. The translation is, almost too perfectly, Potbelly Hill. What came out of the soil over the next 2 decades is what makes the site famous. Working in cooperation with the German Archaeological Institute and the Schönlürfer Museum, Schmidt's team uncovered a series of circular and oval enclosures, each ringed by a wall of stones and dominated by pairs of massive central pillars. They labeled the enclosures with letters. Enclosure A, then B, then C, then D. The pillars in the largest enclosures reach about 5.5 meters in height. According to the published estimates from the German Archaeological Institute's Tepe Telegrams research blog, the heaviest of them weighs somewhere between 7 and 16 tons. They are not piled rubble. They are carefully shaped monoliths quarried from limestone outcrops on the same plateau, transported some distance and set upright in prepared sockets cut into the bedrock. And then there are the carvings. Foxes climbing the sides of pillars, wild boars in low relief, snakes coiled along the bases, scorpions, vultures, cranes, ducks, lions, aurochs. On one famous pillar in enclosure D, a fox is held against the chest of the central T-shaped figure as if it were a small animal cradled in human arms. The figures themselves, the central pillars, are widely interpreted as stylized humans or human-like beings, with the horizontal top representing a head, the vertical shaft a torso, and the carved arms running down the sides ending in hands that fold across the abdomen. Who or what they represent is one of the open questions of the site. The menagerie itself is also striking. The animals that dominate the reliefs are not the species the builders ate. The food refuse from the site is overwhelmingly gazelle and aurochs. The pillars, by contrast, foreground predators and dangerous animals. snakes, scorpions, big cats, raptors. Several archaeologists have suggested the imagery reflects something closer to totemic identification or threat acknowledgement than ordinary hunting iconography. The carvings are stylized but consistent across enclosures, which implies a shared visual vocabulary held in common by whoever was building. The dating is what made archaeologists across the world stop and recalculate. The earliest layers at Göbekli Tepe, the layer designated Layer 3 by Schmidt, have been radiocarbon dated to roughly 9500 to 9000 BCE. According to the Wikipedia summary of the published radiocarbon sequence, which draws on the analyses Schmidt and his colleagues published in the late 2000s and 2010s. The construction phase of the monumental enclosures falls within that pre-pottery Neolithic A window. That makes the oldest structures at the site somewhere between 11,500 and 11,600 years old. Numbers like that need a comparison to feel real. Stonehenge, the megalithic site in southern England that most people imagine when they hear the phrase ancient temple, was built around 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates it by roughly 7,000 years. That gap is longer than all of recorded human history combined. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2500 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates that by about 7,000 years, which means its builders were already dust when the first pharaoh of Egypt was crowned. The first known cities, places like Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, do not appear in the archaeological record until around 3500 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates the first city by about 6,000 years. The site was already ancient when farming was new. It was already buried by the time anyone wrote down a word. The standard model of how civilization arose, the model that dominated archaeology and anthropology through most of the 20th century, ran in a clear sequence. First, the climate stabilized at the end of the last ice age. Second, certain wild grasses were gradually domesticated into cereals, a process that began in the Fertile Crescent somewhere between 9000 and 8000 BCE. Third, agricultural surplus allowed people to live in permanent villages year-round. Fourth, those villages slowly grew into towns. Fifth, towns developed labor specialization, social hierarchies, and concentrated populations. And sixth, finally, those organized societies built the first monuments. Monumental architecture, in this model, sits at the end of a long causal chain that starts with the seed. Göbekli Tepe sits in the wrong place on that chain. The site was built before agriculture took hold in the surrounding region. The pre-pottery Neolithic A period that produced the earliest enclosures is, almost by definition, pre-pottery. The pottery had not been invented yet. Grain storage in any organized sense had not been invented yet. The bones recovered from the construction-era layers at Göbekli Tepe are overwhelmingly the bones of wild game. Gazelle or ox, wild boar, wild ass. The people who shaped, transported, raised, and carved these pillars were hunter-gatherers. They had no fields. They had no granaries. They had somehow the social capacity to coordinate hundreds of people across what may have been generations of work. Schmidt himself spent the rest of his life thinking about what that meant, and the hypothesis he proposed has become, fairly or not, the headline of the site. The slogan version is short. First the temple, then the city. The longer version is that shared religious or ritual practice may have come before agriculture in the causal sequence, rather than after. In Schmidt's reading, the gatherings required to build and maintain a place like Göbekli Tepe would have brought large numbers of hunter-gatherers into sustained contact, generation after generation. That sustained contact, he argued, may have created the social pressure and the practical conditions for the long experiment that produced domesticated cereals. Religion in this model did not arise to glorify the harvest. The harvest arose because religion needed to be fed. If you are finding this useful, there are more stories like this on the channel. That argument is still contested. Some archaeologists have pushed back. noting that the line between ritual structure and ordinary settlement is harder to draw than the early Schmidt-era framing suggested. Newer work at the site has identified what may be domestic features, water management installations, and signs that the enclosures were not as cleanly isolated from daily life as the first published interpretations implied. But even the critics generally accept the core observation that broke the textbook. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was, it was built by people who had not yet farmed, and it was built at a scale that the standard sequence does not predict. Around 8000 BCE, about 1500 years after the earliest enclosures went up, the entire site was deliberately buried. Tons of soil, broken stone, and what looks like the leftovers of repeated feasts were piled into the enclosures and over the pillars until the structures were sealed beneath an artificial mound. This burial is what preserved the site so well. It is also what allowed the surface stones to be mistaken for grave markers thousands of years later. Who did the burying and why they did it, no one knows. The simplest hypothesis is a kind of ritual closure. The more complicated hypotheses are exactly that, more complicated. The fact of the burial is solid. Its meaning is open. The fill itself, when carefully sieved, has yielded enormous quantities of animal bone, particularly aurochs and gazelle. To some researchers, this looks like the remains of repeated large-scale feasts, the kind of gathering that might have brought distant communities together for the work of construction, and, eventually, the work of closure. To others, the fill is more mundane, accumulated debris from generations of use that was simply pushed into place when the time came. The disagreement is unresolved, and the evidence supports both readings. Göbekli Tepe is also no longer alone in the landscape, which is something the early popular coverage of the site sometimes obscured. Over the past decade, Turkish archaeologists working under a coordinated initiative called the Taş Tepeler project, the Stone Hills project, have been excavating a network of related sites across the same region of Şanlıurfa province. The German Archaeological Institute, which still has staff on the ground, describes Taş Tepeler as a Neolithic cultural landscape rather than a single site. And the project has so far mapped roughly 12 locations. The most discussed of the partner sites is Karahantepe, about 35 kilometers east of Göbekli Tepe. Karahantepe is older in some ways and stranger in others. The site was occupied across roughly the same period, from somewhere around 9400 BCE into the 8th millennium, and according to ongoing reporting from the excavation, it preserves more than 200 T-shaped pillars, along with three-dimensional human sculptures that have no clear parallel at Göbekli Tepe itself. Recent excavation seasons at Karahantepe have produced strong evidence of intensive gazelle hunting and legume consumption, which speaks to what the people there were actually eating and how their food economy fit with the monumental work on the surface. Karahantepe looks more like a place where people lived. Göbekli Tepe looks more like a place where people gathered. Together, they suggest that the picture is not one isolated mountain temple, but a whole interconnected world of communal sites threaded across the plain. Other sites in the network include Sefertepe, Ayanlar Hoyuk, and Sabers, where in 2021 excavators uncovered a relief showing a man flanked by leopards and another scene that may be the earliest known narrative composition in stone. None of these places was secret. They are simply being seen properly for the first time, because the recognition of Göbekli Tepe in 1994 taught researchers what to look for. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014 unexpectedly while on summer leave in Germany. He had been working at Göbekli Tepe for 19 years and had become in many ways identified with the site in the public imagination. The German Archaeological Institute reorganized after his death. Lee Clare, a prehistoric archaeologist with the Institute's Istanbul office, took over the research program and continues to coordinate the work in cooperation with Turkish colleagues, including Necmi Karul, who leads excavations at Karahantepe. The site became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018. By the latest published estimates, only around 5% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. The remaining 95% sits beneath the soil, where it has rested for 10,000 years. What does all of this leave us with? It does not leave us, despite the way the site has sometimes been packaged, with an argument for lost civilizations in the science fiction sense. There is no evidence at Göbekli Tepe of advanced technology, no metallurgy, no writing, no machinery. The people who built it worked stone with stone tools. The achievement is human scale and explicable. What it does leave us with is a quieter and more interesting revision. The assumption that complex, coordinated effort required agriculture first turns out to have been a piece of folk theory dressed up as established science. Hunter-gatherers, given the right cultural reasons, were capable of organizing themselves into the kind of long-term collective project that builds something like this. They were capable of carrying stones that weigh more than 10 tons across several hundred meters of broken ground. They were capable of teaching the techniques and the imagery to the next generation, and the generation after that, for centuries. It also leaves us with a recalibration of what religion or shared belief might have done in the deepest past. The textbook story made religion a late development, a kind of cultural ornament added once material conditions made it possible. Schmidt's hypothesis, even in its hedged form, points in the other direction. The gathering may have come first. The reasons to gather, whatever those reasons actually were, may have been older and more powerful than the practical economy that grew up to sustain them. And it leaves us with a long list of open questions, which is, in a way, the most honest thing the site offers. We do not know what the carvings meant. We do not know whether the central T-shaped pillars represent ancestors, gods, abstract beings, or something for which we have no word at all. We do not know what songs or words were spoken inside the enclosures. We do not know why, after 1,500 years, the whole place was deliberately buried, or what the people who did the burying believed they were doing. We do not know what is still under the 95% of the mound that no one has touched. What we do know is that an archaeologist walked up a hill in October of 1994, saw what others had missed, and started an excavation that pushed the recognized origin of monumental human cooperation back by roughly 7,000 years. The textbook the site rewrote is still being rewritten. The work is generational, and most of the people who will read its final draft have not been born yet. If you enjoyed this story, there are more like it on the channel.